important point. So I will turn it over to Liz Menard.
I want to thank Lori first and foremost for not only such a lovely introduction, but for just doing such a fantastic job of curating this exhibition, both exhibitions. It's just beautiful. Thank you. This isn't the first time I've shown here. I've exhibited here twice before in group exhibitions. I was in the Around the Frayed Edges and also in the Canadian Jury Landscape exhibition. And if anybody saw the Around the Frayed Edges, I proposed a piece on linen that would be a contemporary toile de jouy, and it was talking about how we must protect our environment and particularly our water. And my husband and I had a cottage in Balsam Lake at that point in time, and he had said, let's go fishing. So he took 2 rods and I took my sketch pad. We came back and I had a drawing that I turned into an etching that was just a little island at Balsam Lake. And I printed it, and then I took it and I cut it in 3 pieces and stitched it onto a Western paper of BFK Reeves. And then when the call came out for Around the Frayed Edges, I thought, if I print this on linen and sew it on another textile, that would be really cool. The reason I'm telling you this story is that that's kind of where these pieces have come from as well. Because when Lori invited me, I sort of went back to the first work I did for this gallery, and this series of collagraphs that are printed. Collagraphs are another kind of print medium, and I'll talk about them if you're interested. I printed these on BFK Reeves, but I also wanted something very ephemeral. And so, being as Robert prints on silk, and I love silk, I thought it would be a really nice tie-in and a way also to exhibit the work. So, long-winded, sorry. The other exhibition I was in was the Canadian Jury Landscape exhibition, and I do love Canadian landscape. And if you look around, you'll see urban and wilderness landscapes. And you'll see Buttermilk Falls over there in the corner, which is a place that's near and dear to my heart and has been since I was a child. You'll also see a pine tree up near Dwight. Then there's also Algonquin Park, there's Balsam Lake. And then the 3 etchings, which you see over there, are the Lower Don River in Toronto. And in the 1880s, the City Fathers decided to straighten and channelize this formerly meandering, beautiful river to allow ships to come up to the factories. And in their wisdom or lack thereof, they didn't dredge deep enough. So it continued to silt and could never be used for the purpose in which it was designed, permanently altering the nature of the river and what came to be built upon it. So we have sort of these contrasting landscapes. And I think that in terms of Minden, I think the river here, the Gull River, has also been straightened somewhat, because if you look either side of town, it's a lot more meandering. So there was a little bit of a parallel there. But what I want to do is explain to you, I said they're etchings, and I want to show you what an etching plate looks like for when I do it, okay? This is a piece of copper, and I work with roofing copper. I buy my copper at Danforth Roofing in Scarborough. Okay, I do. The guys laugh when I come in because I get really excited at 3x8 sheets of copper. And we always have to pick through to find the ones that aren't scratched, because if they're scratched, I have to do a lot more work. But they're really patient and nice guys. What I do is I get my copper to the size I want it, then I put a resist on it. And the resist is an asphaltum and beeswax mix that I paint on. When this resist dries, I then take a needle, it's just like a pen, and I draw my image into the copper. And this is a large plate. If you look at my handmade book there, you'll see a smaller version of the same river with the lines of the channelization of the Don drawn through it. And I took that from a map in the Toronto Archives from the 1880s. Once I have my outline and I have a sense of where I'm going with it, I may then go back into the plate to create more texture. And what you're seeing down the middle of this river is called aquatint. And an aquatint, Goya was the master of aquatint. And to make aquatint, I have to go back, and I'm going to try and show you this way. Okay. So I've covered it all with the resist. I've exposed where the river is. I put this into ferric chloride, and depending upon how deep I want my plate bitten, that determines how long I leave it in the acid. And it's really not an acid, it is a salt, it's ferric chloride, so it's actually quite benign. To get the texture, and if you look at those etchings there, anywhere that you see different shades of gray, that will be an aqua tint. And to achieve that, I then clean my plate and protect the areas that I don't want to have the acid bite at it again. And use rosin, just the same kind of rosin that's used to do a bow in a stringed instrument. Have little, particles of rosin fall down onto the plate. And I either fuse it with heat, or there's a really cool fusion box we have at the studio, open studio where I work. And it fuses it with isopropylene alcohol, which I've never seen that properly. Anyway, it fuses it, and then I put it back in the acid. And again, the acid will bite away. Everywhere that there's a particle of rosin, it is protected. The acid eats everything else that has not been protected. And that's how I get the different layers. So I just brought this out to show you what goes into making these. So all these pieces started off, except these holograms, they all started off as copper plates. So I don't know, does that explain it in terms of the process? Once I have the plate the way I want it, I then put ink on it, I ink it up, I then hand wipe it, and remove ink so that anywhere I want white to show, I've taken all the ink off. And to get my gray tones, the aqua tint generally helps me with that, but also the way I wipe the plate is all part of it. There were some cute young ladies asking me about these pieces. These are also done the same way. I start with a copper plate. This is called shinkole, and shinkole is where I take a piece, in this case, of handmade Japanese paper. It's an inshugambi. And I've prepared all my plate, I put ink on my plate, then I take my inshugambi, which is just like working with butterfly wings. And you bring it over to the copper plate, and you trim all 4 edges, and each edge takes a separate razor blade. So I go through the boxes of 100 razor blades like this when I'm doing this kind of work, because for each one there's 4 razor blades used. That's how careful and precise you need to be to get this exactly as it ought to be. So my plate is inked, my inshugambi is there. I then put an archival paste on top of the inshugambi. I put the plate on the press, the inshugambi, then I take a piece of Western paper, put that on top of the other 2, and put it through the printing press. And when it comes out the other end, if everything is as it ought to be, it will be perfectly adhered to the backing paper. So it is quite a process. There's 3 etchings on the back there of nightshades in various forms. I have done nothing other than just do the shinkole. However, for these native species pieces here that have more information on them, I went in and I have done, I can't even count how many French knots. They're all hand-done French knots. And then I've also done pastel work, just to bring out some of the characteristic of these wonderful species. Does that answer all your questions?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Oh, and so when you put the color on, like, you've got blues and greens, that goes on it?
That's the very last thing I do. After I've done all my stitching, then I just go back in and I just add some pastel.
Pastel?
Yes, they're chalk pastel. They're beautiful, buttery, soft pastels.
Where does the stitching come in? I don't understand that.
Well, I have the print, okay? I have the piece printed,
Yeah,
and all the information is on here, except not these little pink.
not the color, so it's all in...
It's
yeah.
black and white. It's
Yeah.
it would look like that. See the one there, the big, the climbing nightshade?
Yes, yes.
That's what these all look like. Except you can see if you look at these closely, you'll see there's a lot of other information on the plate itself.
Yes.
All right? And then I go in, and all these little bits are on the plate. So if I printed it, you would still know that this is smartweed.
Yeah.
But by coming in after the fact and stitching the French knots, I just think...
Oh, so you actually do stitch?
I
Or are you
actually-
using that as a word to describe?
No, I am
Okay.
literally sitting there with
Okay.
needle and thread, and it takes me days.
Oh, gosh.
Okay, because there's so many. But to me, it's the characteristic of this plant, and I think these native species are so important. And there's so many interesting things that we're sort of overlooking, that's why I think it's worth taking the time to really, it's the little things. These leaves, for example, these are not leaves, these are handmade Japanese paper. And I take the paper and I hand cut them, and then I etch some of them, I don't etch all of them, and then I hand color them. Multiple layers of watercolor, I glaze them, and then I use something called konyaku, which is a Japanese powdered hibiscus root, mix it into a paste, I paint them both sides and I shape them. And these are leaves that are being attacked by the Asian longhorn beetle, and that's how that whole thing got started. So this is why we have to not move firewood from one place to another.
Are you able to reuse your color plates?
I can reuse them. I can print multiple pieces from them. For example, the book that you see, that's an edition of 30, so I was able to print 30 different, but they're all done by hand, and each one is hand wiped. I also, being rather frugal, I will flip it over and use the other side. So I don't know, does this give you?
I just wondered, the thread that you use, is I like French silk.
No, I use French silk to sew these silk pieces, but for this is DMC 100% cotton embroidery floss.
Wow.
Because it's color fast.
Yeah.
I'm like printing press. And it kind of got started when the call went out for around the frayed edges, and I made the connection that if, like Charles Oberkammer in the 17th century, I print my copper plate images on linen, this is something that could be really exciting.
Did you mention your chair?
No, I didn't. Thank you, Lord.
She's upholstered an entire chair now.
2 chairs. I have 2 chairs that I did a very large copper plate etching of the Don River watershed as I would like it to be. So it's not straightened and channelized. There's forests and the lost rivers that have been built over have surfaced again, and the mouth is a marsh. And so I printed this very large piece on linen and had 2 Louis XIV chairs that I had upholstered. And they were also part of my exhibition. So, like, this is timeless. You can do this. They've been doing this since the 17th century. This very method, which is totally cool. Like, this is not that. Like, I love technology. I have a website. I wouldn't be without my computer. But if there's a blackout, I can still work.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, are there any more questions for Liz? Okay, thank you, Liz, very much.